The Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century CE existed in a state of profound moral, spiritual, and social crisis, a period Muslims would later call al-Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance. Yet this designation speaks not to a lack of intelligence or culture, but to a society unmoored from divine guidance, where the absence of revealed truth had allowed human nature's darkest impulses to flourish unchecked. As dawn struggles to break over the endless expanse of sand and stone, the landscape itself seems to bear witness to this spiritual desolation. The desert, magnificent in its harsh beauty, holds secrets buried beneath centuries of windswept dunes. Half-submerged idols emerge from the sand like tombstones marking the death of primordial monotheism, remnants of a forgotten covenant between humanity and the divine. The very earth appears to groan under the weight of accumulated injustice, waiting for a transformation that would reshape not merely Arabia, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. This was Arabia before the light of Islam, a land paradoxically rich in poetry yet impoverished in mercy. Sophisticated in trade yet primitive in justice, united by language yet shattered by endless tribal warfare. The fractured peninsula, a nation in name only. To understand pre-Islamic Arabia is to comprehend a fundamental truth. There was no Arabia in any meaningful political sense, only Arabia's countless tribal territories defined more by blood feuds than borders, more by ancestral grudges than geographic boundaries. The peninsula stretched vast and unforgiving, yet its people lived in deliberate isolation from one another, their camps scattered across the desert like islands in an ocean of sand. Each tribe existed as a self-contained universe, complete with its own customs, allegiances, and enemies. Tribal banners fluttered in the relentless wind, markers of identity that simultaneously proclaimed pride and perpetuated division. The distance between camps was measured not just in miles but in mistrust. In memories of slights real and imagined, in blood debts passed from grandfather to grandson like bitter heirlooms. This fragmentation wasn't merely political, it was existential. A man's tribe was his nation, his identity, his only guarantee of protection in a lawless land. Beyond the circle of firelight that marked his camp's boundary lay not fellow countrymen but potential enemies. The concept of a unified Arabia, of shared destiny or common cause beyond immediate kinship, was as foreign to this time as rain to the desert in summer. Armed silhouettes stood perpetual watch on the horizons, sentinels against a world where every stranger posed a threat. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like the dust that never quite settled. This was a society organized for survival through strength alone, where vulnerability meant extinction and compassion was considered dangerous naivete. Blood for blood, the eternal cycle. If fragmentation was pre-Islamic Arabia's curse, tribal warfare was its expression. The desert was a stage for endless confrontation, where disputes escalated with terrifying speed from insult to massacre. The principle was brutally simple. Harm done to one member of the tribe was harm done to all, demanding retaliation not against the individual perpetrator alone, but against his entire clan. Picture the moment before battle. Two tribal forces arrayed against each other across an expanse of sand, spears and swords raised toward an indifferent sky. Dust swirls between them, animated by the same wind that carries their war cries. This frozen instant contains the entire tragedy of Jahiliyyah intelligent men about to slaughter each other over grievances their great-grandfathers initiated, perpetuating cycles of violence that no one can remember beginning but no one dares to end. These weren't wars of conquest or ideology in the modern sense. They were exercises in honor culture taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. A man's worth was measured by his willingness to kill and die for his tribe's reputation. Peacemakers were scorned as cowards. Warriors who showed mercy risked being branded as traitors. The most celebrated poetry of the era didn't sing of love or wisdom, it immortalized battles, glorified vengeance, and mocked enemies with sophisticated cruelty. Blood feuds could span generations. A child might be raised hearing stories of an uncle killed before he was born, nurtured on hatred for people he'd never met, prepared to sacrifice his life settling accounts he didn't create. This was justice in Jahiliyyah, not the restoration of balance or the establishment of peace, but the satisfaction of tribal pride through equivalent or greater violence. The desert itself became a graveyard of forgotten conflicts, its sands concealing the bones of men who died, for causes they couldn't articulate in service of a code that guaranteed their suffering would continue through their children and their children's children. The corrupted sanctuary, when the house of God became a marketplace of idols, At the heart of Arabia stood the Kaaba, that ancient cubic structure whose origins stretched back to Ibrahim and Ismail, peace be upon them, built as a monument to the oneness of God. But by the 6th century, this sanctuary had been transformed into something its original architects would have found unrecognizable a pantheon housing. 360 idols, each representing a different tribe's deity, each a testament to humanity's capacity for spiritual innovation in the wrong direction. The Kaaba, meant to be the purest symbol of Tawḥīd, monotheism, had become the headquarters of shirk, polytheism. The sacred precinct buzzed with activity as pilgrims came not to worship the creator of the heavens and earth, but to supplicate carved stones that could neither hear their prayers nor answer their needs. The irony was profound. People circumambulated the house built for the worship of the one God while directing their devotion to creations of their own hands. From a distance, the scene might have appeared devout crowds gathering, rituals being performed, offerings being made. But this was piety inverted, worship misdirected. The warm desert light illuminated a spiritual catastrophe, where the form of religion persisted while its substance had been completely hollowed out. People bowed before gods of wood and stone, their prayers ascending no higher than the physical idols themselves. The intimacy of delusion, close encounters with false gods. To understand the depth of this spiritual crisis, one must look closer, not at the crowds and rituals, but at the individual relationship between worshiper and idol. An ancient stone deity, roughly carved with primitive tools, sits surrounded by offerings, dates, milk, fabric, precious incense whose smoke rises in thin tendrils before dissipating into nothingness. This is devotion as tragedy. Intelligent human beings, capable of composing exquisite poetry and navigating by stars, prostrating themselves before objects that possess no consciousness, no power, no capacity to reciprocate the faith invested in them. The idol cannot see the tears of the desperate mother praying for her sick child, cannot hear the merchant seeking prosperity, cannot intervene in the life of the warrior begging for victory. Yet the practice persisted, passed from generation to generation as unquestioned tradition. Children grew up watching their parents worship these stones and learned to do the same, never questioning, never considering that the God who created the vast desert and the intricate complexity of human life might not reside in a statue that couldn't even protect itself from erosion. The darkness here isn't merely religious error, it's the voluntary blindness that prevents people from seeing the obvious. The idol worshipper must constantly suppress the rational faculty that would ask, why would the creator of the universe need my food offerings? Why would the sustainer of all existence be confined to this specific stone in this specific location? The suppression of these questions became a form of intellectual and spiritual self-mutilation. The tyranny of power, when might makes right. The spiritual bankruptcy of Jahiliyyah Arabia found its perfect complement in social and economic injustice. Without divine law to establish universal standards of human dignity and rights, society organized itself along the most primitive lines. The strong dominated, the weak suffered, and power itself became the only meaningful form of legitimacy. Picture the interior of a tribal leader's tent. Firelight flickers across expensive textiles while the chief sits in comfortable authority, his posture radiating confidence born of unchallenged power. Before him stands a poor tribesman, body language speaking of enforced humility, hands empty of everything except perhaps a desperate petition that will likely go unanswered. This scene, multiplied across Arabia, reveals the true structure of Jahiliyyah society. Justice wasn't blind, it was entirely absent. The wealthy and powerful made decisions that affected everyone but answered to no one. There were no appeals to universal principles, no higher authority to which the oppressed could turn, no framework of rights that protected the vulnerable. Disputes were resolved not through impartial arbitration, but through the calculation of relative power. Could the wronged party muster enough tribal support to force restitution? If not, they had no recourse. The concept that a poor person and a rich person might have equal standing before the law, that justice might be based on truth rather than strength, was alien to this time and place. This wasn't merely economic inequality. It was the complete absence of any social safety net or recognized duty toward the vulnerable. The orphan, the widow, the elderly person without strong family, these were people without protection in a system that recognized only power. The chains of bondage, human property in the desert. Perhaps no institution better exemplifies the moral nadir of pre-Islamic Arabia than the practice of slavery. Under the harsh sun of Jahiliyyah, human beings were reduced to property. Their labor extracted through coercion, their bodies bought and sold in markets alongside livestock and grain. The enslaved carried burdens that bent their backs and broke their spirits, toiling without hope of freedom or even basic recognition of their humanity. This wasn't the complex, varied institution slavery would become in later civilizations. This was bondage in its most primitive form, where captives from raids or debtors who couldn't pay became the property of others. With no legal personality, no rights, no expectation that their children might know anything different. What made this particularly cruel was its arbitrariness. The line between free and enslaved was determined not by any moral failing or voluntary choice, but by accidents of birth or misfortunes of war. A person might be born free, but through tribal warfare or economic catastrophe find themselves in chains. Their children would inherit their enslaved status, generation after generation, bound not by their own choices, but by circumstances beyond their control. The system persisted because it was economically convenient and because there was no moral framework powerful enough to challenge it. Those who benefited from slave labor, which is to say, most of the powerful, had no incentive to question an arrangement that served them so well. And those who suffered under it lacked any platform from which to voice objection. A woman sits alone outside her tent as evening light fades across the desert, her posture conveying a sadness that goes beyond personal grief to encompass an entire gender's systematic marginalization. In the distance, the camp continues its businessmen making decisions, conducting trade, planning raids, while she remains excluded from meaningful participation in society beyond the limited roles assigned to her sex. Women could be inherited like property upon a man's death. They had no right to refuse marriage, no claim to inheritance, no voice in tribal councils. Their testimony was considered unreliable, their judgment questionable, their very existence sometimes treated as a burden rather than a blessing. The segregation wasn't merely spatial, it was existential. Women lived in a parallel society, their lives circumscribed by walls both literal and metaphorical. Their intelligence, creativity, and potential were systematically suppressed in service of a social order that recognized only masculine virtues and masculine authority.